So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start questions of my panelists here to give you guys some time to ask questions. But we really want this session to be very interactive. So again, I've given you a warning, but hopefully after we start the conversation here, you all will have some questions that you'd like to ask. And then just the idea that what we talked about at our excursion, what we're talking about today, will be wrapped up into a white paper that will be available for folks. Okay? So Chairman Taub, let me start with you. One of the issues that was brought up about was particularly about the USO. So what do you think the USO needs to be in the future, and what do you think is going to have to take for us to either get a good sense of it or to define it or understand what we need in the future?
Thank you, Lori. Before I begin, thank you and John for convening this session and this event. I guess we're on 7.0 of PostalVision 2020, and I think with each one, it's a great opportunity for all of us, not just in the postal delivery sector, but what I like about it, it brings in perspectives outside that, and that's, I think, the way we can look at public policy issues and move forward. So that's my little start to thank. In regard to the question, why else, from my perspective, is the United States Postal Service 100% part of the executive branch than to provide universal service? That really is the reason, it seems to me, why it is part of the executive branch. It's not quasi-private, quasi-government, quasi-anything. It's totally part of the government. And yet, as you indicated, under the structure that we have, it is meant to be self-sustaining, that the ratepayers pay that cost. It is not funded by the taxpayer. And so given those two premises, that it's a government institution to provide universal service, and we want to make sure it's self-sustaining, my concern is because of all the changes that are going on in the marketplace that we have today, without a clear definition of knowing exactly what universal service is, we can't really be sure of the exact cost, and hence we can't be sure that the Postal Service has the monies it needs to continue to provide universal service. For most of the 241 years of our post office and postal service history, Congress has rarely defined specifically what universal service is. It's been more very prescriptive commands to bind the nation together. And that's served the nation and the Postal Service well for much of this time because it's allowed them to adapt to its budgetary constraints and generally meet what they think are the needs. I would argue in 2017, however, that's a difficult place to be in because each of us and policymakers in Congress may have a different view of how large or small that is, and their expectations may not be met. The Postal Regulatory Commission in 2008 did a study on universal service as mandated by law, and it came up with that there's 7 features, 7 attributes that would go into defining universal service. The first is geographic. What is the geographic range that has to be covered? The range of products. Is it just letters? Is it all postal products that they offer? Access to facilities. Should there be a certain number of facilities, and how do you access that? The fourth area is delivery frequency, and frankly, that's the only of the 7 that Congress has, since 1982, consistently mandated, which is mandating the Postal Service must provide 6 days of delivery. The other is prices, affordability for the universal service offerings, quality of service, and the last area are users' rights or enforcement. Unlike most other countries in the planet that have very specific definitions for most of those attributes and require that their postal services meet that through regulation, licensing, contract, in the United States, as I said, we haven't done that. And so I believe it's time that we explore that. How would we do that? I think in the current environment we're in, it's difficult for Congress to kind of get to these first principles, but we have an example, and I'd leave it at that. In 1996, Congress passed what was the Telecommunications Act of 1996, really a major law that was starting to position the telecom world as we were seeing in the internet age. And part of that was to mandate that the Federal Communications Commission, under very clear guidelines that Congress put in place, define universal service in the telecom space. You could envision that a Congress in a similar way could mandate that the postal regulator, the Postal Regulatory Commission, undertake a definition of universal service under guidelines and attributes that they put in place. And it would seem to me we could finally have then a clear definition that could be modified and revisited by the regulator, but then we know what the cost is to ensure it's self-sustaining.
Okay, and I'd love to, I'll turn it over to you in a minute, Ramesh, but let me ask the professor. So, in the research that you did with IG and what you're doing now, has the dependency on the U.S., has it changed over time? What are we looking at in the future? What do people really want and or need?
I think it has really changed, and what I wanted to do was build off sort of the last thing Robert said. It really is time, and it really is important that we define universal service. I think everyone kind of avoided it for a long time because they thought it was a pathway to freedom. Honestly, it's a formula for being lost and staying lost. Until we define what USO means, we can't price it out, we can't touch it or model it, we can't discuss it really, and we can't fix it and develop metrics for success. We're stuck in this endless debate by ill-informed parties. And they're
Other
not.
than us, we're not the ill-informed parties, right?
Well, actually, Ramesh was who I.
Yeah, right.
Thank you. We're not getting more postal experts on the Hill, for instance. We're getting fewer, and the same is true for the White House. So we need to refresh. We need to define it, and before we do that, we need to refresh some of our thinking from the last time we tried to define it. We need to fully recognize, maybe for the first time ever, the contribution of the express companies and of Amazon in helping lift the load of the USO. The work share arrangements and contracts for transportation and others. And we need to recognize the availability of alternate forms of communication, the internet and all of its children, for all of the people and all of the businesses, and the emergence of new digital payment systems. None of those were thought about when we first thought about universal service. We also need to revisit, the second part is we need to revisit the sanctity of mail. Where do we need it and where do we really not need it, and where are we not sure? We need to decompose the mail piece types and ask what level is sanctity of mail needed for that. For the single piece letter, we're already going to get into debate. Congressman Wiener would probably say you need more security on the mail. People can open it and see it far too often, and I've been destroyed because of it. Lorena Bobbitt would probably say it's fine, don't change a thing. It's working. But what about the sanctity of mail for parcels, things of value traveling inside those? And for advertising mail, do you really need sanctity of mail protection for advertising? Remittances, probably a much stronger case. And the news and the magazines that travel through the mail. And finally, do we need to try to make it bulletproof against the mails being used for crimes and for fraud that are being committed? So going back to mail and pieces, should the sanctity of the mail, of physical mail, be more important than email? Well, really? I'm thinking maybe it should. And because people in this age when everybody's being herded forward by technology changes, shouldn't there be some choices and some options and some desire when you need more security over the mail to be able to have an option for it? And certainly things of value need special protection as they travel through the mail, and they can be things of extreme value. Diamonds in parcels. And there's an increasing parade of people that go onto your property, onto your porch, and can walk and can get into your mailbox as delivery options increase and increase and increase. Another thing that would probably be part of this is reviewing the decision that was made on the Postal Inspection Service. It was a very odd outcome that happened when the IG was created in 1996. The Inspection Service stopped inspecting, but they didn't stop. The IRS inspection, when they created an IG there, they put them together and they became one organization. Absent that, there are duplicate management, duplicate support services, and it's not inexpensive. The inspection service budget is nearly $500 million a year. So it's big enough to deserve a place on the table. There's also a kind of odd party and interest feel to the Postal Service having a police force but no one else. There's not a police force for FedEx or UPS or Amazon. So let me just kind of review that real quickly and then I'll be done. We definitely need to model where we should have post offices, the frequency of delivery, and service standards. And the service standards need to become enforceable, probably through the PRC, so that it's not conflicted. We need to review diversification. If diversity was allowed, as it is allowed around the world, post offices would change from being loss centers to profit centers. And the consolidation of delivery, not the proliferation of delivery of trucks that are pouring into your neighborhood. There's pollution, fuel, waste, there's the risk to safety, a parade of trucks going through your quiet neighborhood. Someone needs to look at whether the monopoly needs to be revised to encourage a consolidation. That would also provide revenue, and it would be great for both citizens and the public. And then lastly, there needs to be a change mechanism to update all this in a very rapidly changing world that does not involve Congress. Bless their hearts, as they say in the South. It's got to be more adaptive. This is a period of immense, rapid, blurry change. And there needs to be a mechanism to change and update that.
Okay, thanks. So Ramesh, we keep hearing about the telecom. So Robert talked about it was defined, and it's been interesting that we've actually tried to address the USO idea in telecom. Talk to us a little bit about what's worked there, what hasn't worked there, and what are the lessons learned that we can apply to as we go forward in postal world?
Thanks, Laurie. I think I probably should follow Andrew's lead and do a little context first. I'm also the youngest. I'm CEO of Bell & Howell, which is a mailing equipment technology company. But I spent about 4 years at Pitney Bowes, and my first PostalVision 2020 was about 7 years ago. And I was here to present why I was investing $25 million a year in a digital delivery service called Wally, which, by the way, is still kind of struggling. But for 5 years before that, I was a COO at a trade association called the DMA, representing mailers, and spent a lot of time on the Hill talking to senators and congresspeople about why they shouldn't regulate and destroy a mailing industry the way they regulated and destroyed a telecom industry called telemarketing. And so there are some significant parallels, but let me actually give you a couple of historical facts why I think it's important. The term universal service is actually credited to Theodore Vail. And Theodore Vail, by the way, was the CEO of AT&T, actually American Bell, which became AT&T with the creation of the Bell system in partnership with JP Morgan. But Theodore Vail learned the concept of universal service before he went to American Bell. He was the head of the Railway Postal Service. So he learned the concept of universal service, of providing the same price anywhere. I forget the actual term, it's called rural free delivery, RFD. And he used that concept to say same stamp, same penny stamp, all over the country. But when he created the Bell system, he said one policy, one system, universal service. And what he was trying to do was he wasn't trying to be a nice guy. He was trying to consolidate the telecom world at that point in the US, which had 2,000 providers. And he consolidated them into one company. And he convinced, through the Kingsbury Agreement, convinced the US government to enable him to essentially run a monopoly in this country. And the monopoly lasted for a very long time. And it was Judge Green in 1984 who finally broke up that monopoly. Now, I have to tell you, personally, I felt it. I spent about 16 years at Bell Labs, which is part of AT&T. And one of the personal losses I felt was the loss of something like Bell Labs, as the Bell system broke up. But professionally, the breakup of the telecom monopoly, called the Bell system, I think created trillions of dollars of value in this country. So companies like Google, Facebook, Netflix would not exist if the telecom monopoly had not been broken. So I actually believe that breaking the postbox monopoly, let me call it that way, is an important part of unlocking enormous value that sits in our postal network. I actually believe that technology can be an enabler. I actually believe that it can be good for letter carriers, postal employees. It can be good for citizens, receivers. By the way, the service quality standards in the postal network, and having been at the DMA and supported the interests of mailers, I can tell you is heavily slanted towards mailers, not towards receivers, not towards citizens, not towards people who actually get mail, because it's all sender paid. The postal network is dramatically changing in terms of the mix of what it carries. And more, what it carries is paid for by receivers and not senders. In the telecom world, I think we understood that who pays actually has more say in how you regulate or design a particular network. And I think we're going to see that. So I know Lori's got a bunch of other questions about technology, and I won't get into the details yet, but overall, I think I want to make it clear, as a scientist and a technologist, I'm sad about what we did to the Bell system and the loss of the prominence of Bell Labs, which invented most of what we call the internet today. But as a CEO of a company and a capitalist and an entrepreneur, I think we can contribute tremendously to this country's and the citizens, the quality of life, the opportunities for everyone by taking apart the postal monopoly.
Well, on that springboard, I have plenty of questions, but I would rather hear from you all. If anyone out there has a question they'd like to throw out.
Thank you, Laurie. So many questions and so much to say. I'd like to paraphrase your question because I don't think the panel answered it. And I think your question was, and say it simply, what is a desirable USO in 10 years' time? We've defined the USO as it exists today, and the panel talked about direction, we need to do this, that, but they didn't answer the question, what is a desirable, useful USO for the Postal Service in the future? Specifically, frequency of delivery, specifically post office network. And if we can link to the previous excellent session, the power of proximity, we saw a map of 31,000 postal outlets servicing 100% of the population. If we were to draw that map as the other speaker, Ian, did for Australia, you'd still have the same number of post offices relative to the population and so on, except he told us they were agency post offices. So they're still post offices, but they're run in a different manner. And if we then went to the UPS model, where 1/6 of the number of offices serviced still a very high proportion of the population, what was wrong with that particular model? So I'd really like the panel to say, not what they're constrained to do or what the current Congress says about 6 days. What do they think the citizens of this country will want from this service in so many years' time?
I can take that one, Elmar. You know, when the USO was defined for telecom, it was based on what's called POTS, plain old telephone service. Over the course of the last few decades, it has evolved from focusing on POTS to broadband. As a matter of fact, I think I have some statistics that say that today, a majority of Americans, 52%, list their mobile number as their primary access number. So a landline telephone number is irrelevant pretty much. Even, by the way, I'm a baby boomer, so 23% of baby boomers, the gray hairs, have gone mobile. We still have a landline phone in our house. And as a matter of fact, you know, in the FCC, they've shifted their focus on USO from landline telephones to mobile to now broadband, because everything became an application on internet protocol on broadband access. So I think someone talked about Wi-Fi. So as a matter of fact, the FCC is now trying to use E-rate funds, which is a universal service fund. I think it's called Connect America Fund, where all the carriers pay into this fund, and then they use those funds to ensure universal coverage on certain dimensions. Like, so poor children don't have to figure out how to find a Starbucks so they can get a Wi-Fi connection to do their homework. They can actually get Wi-Fi no matter where they live. So proximity, access. Let's take the Postal Service. Already we know that the mix of what's going on in terms of what's carried, whether it's communications in the form of letters, whether it is bills and statements, whether it's marketing mail, and now more and more parcels, packets, the fulfillment of commerce in terms of exchange of goods and services, that mix is changing. So I expect that our definition of USO, and I look to Chairman Taub and the PRC to take a leadership role on this, is going to recognize a change of mix. And it's, as much as I like my friend Professor Williams, I disagree with him, that, you know, the letter should have more protection than a piece of email. Well, if it's a very high value item like my blood test results, whether it's electronic or physical, probably has much more value than my bank statement that I'm getting from Citibank. So I think, what does USO mean, and what should it mean in the future? And by the way, I think Australia is a great example of being able to get government services, access to identification, identity verification. There's some things that are inherently physical. I think it was a year ago, Estonia gave me an e-residency where I can basically sign documents from a business point of view, from anywhere in the world. But I had to physically travel to Estonia to verify my identity. So there's certain things that have to be done in person, physically, cannot be done digitally or remotely. So I think technology enables a whole host of possibilities of how to redefine universal service obligation.
Anyone like to
I
add to that?
I would. That of course is not correct. I think it does need to begin with modeling. That's going to solve so much of this endless dilemma. We need to know, and Esri almost has it done. I just saw them do it. The model for how many post offices and network points. I think we've got to get over the diversification ban. It has locked the Postal Service into a kind of bug in amber future for themselves. It's a death sentence. No one can stop evolving, and that's exactly what the marching orders are today. I think they can do a lot. You heard the Postmaster General from the Lebanese Post talk about how he introduced front office services and post offices and some of the things Ramesh just said. Don't tell me we can't do it. If he can do it, anybody can do it. He carried this gorgeous flower through the rubble of this apocalypse now without a scratch. We have no excuses If he can do it, we can do it. I would try to continue, probably through incentives, the consolidation of the delivery point into a single hand. And I would think that those carriers should migrate to become much more like neighborhood logistics managers, supporting freelance workers, people with special needs, the elderly. We are going to need all those things. There's a world coming at us that's not very forgiving. We need them to be the physical part of the smart cities that are approaching us, and there's really not a substitute. As the speaker said on the previous panel, this is the last frontier. This is the last ability to deliver the atomic part of the time-space continuum. If we switch over, if we destroy all those access points at the frontier of this new challenge, we'll never get it back. When it's gone, it's gone. We'd better take that very seriously.
So, maybe I'm going to go in the wrong direction since Rich is the one who made a comment. I guess I'm going to go against it. I am not a proponent of doing away with the Postal Service or the Postal Network. And I know that's not what you said. You said that basically divesting it. But when we look at the proximity aspect, what you were talking about, Dave, is to me is spot on, right? Being able to get to an environment where the local communities are supporting themselves from a management perspective with regards to how mail and other communications are being dealt with. The ability to give internet to the low-income people, right? The ability to give them a place to go in which to be able to utilize it, like our public libraries. So there's a lot of things that the Postal Service can do. Breaking it apart into many postal networks, my fear would be that we would then become like other countries around the world, where yes, Germany as an example. Yes, they may only have one building that's owned by Deutsche Post. However, they have not embraced the idea of work share concept because they've gone too protectionist. They have the ability of having multiple carriers and they have all these different things, but they are all controlled by Deutsche Post. So we need to be very careful when we talk about the divestiture of our postal network. Australia has agents, right? So that's a good thing. But they all follow a set of rules and are held to a set of standards and pricing that they have to adhere to. We, in the world economy today, enjoy the lowest postal rates of any, I'll say, first world country. And that's because of the power of the postal network. No real question.
I'm concerned about privatization on two fronts. Number one, there's a very strong possibility of there becoming conflict of interest problems. Companies instinctively combine and ally, and we can't have an infrastructure that picks winners and losers. Secondly, it would cause the construction of a huge new bureaucracy to license and inspect and enforce all of those standards you just described. We all need to be able to run on those airwaves and railroad tracks and highways, and those are for everybody. That it's not for a combination of people that are going to destroy efficient market forces and exhibit favoritism toward a privileged group.
I think David's one of the smartest guys in the world, but I actually disagree with him. Seriously, I mean, think about a situation where the U.S. Postal Service is a franchise organization that tomorrow tells all 30,000 postmasters, you are now the owner of your own business. I'll franchise it to you. You own it, I'll give you the specifications, you'll still wear a uniform, I'll provide you the same security, I'll provide you with common pricing, I'll provide you with common IT infrastructure. Let me tell you, I mean, it's a little scary going there because L'Enfant Plaza will probably shrink. You won't need the superstructure of the management of the Postal Service because you're now distributing it to a local level. You'll enable 30,000 entrepreneurial businesses or more. And it's not just the post offices. It's probably components of the post office. It's probably, it enables logistics. I just heard today, there's an entire industry on reverse logistics that is waiting to happen. Think about how many companies would pay someone in the reverse logistics business. And as a matter of fact, I think I heard at least one of the speakers say, oh, the Postal Service actually does that today. You want me to pick up something? I'll pick it. But no one seems to know about it. There's a huge revenue opportunity in reverse logistics waiting to happen. If every postmaster was the owner of their own business and was aware of the fact that they could pick up parcels and be paid for it either by the homeowner or by Walmart or Amazon or Zara or some brand, today they're prevented probably from doing anything outside the realm of here are the standard products, but entrepreneurs will find ways to create new business opportunities.
All right. We have
Lori?
a question here, and
sure.
I want to follow up on that too, but I'd like to hear your question. You can follow up. No, go ahead, because we might be thinking this question.
I would be impressed. So, despite my very brief foray into this ecosystem so far, one of the things that really strikes me is the very deep sense of responsibility that everyone is conveying through their own lens and their own right. And I guess just building off of this gentleman's much more eloquent question, and maybe even constraining it, if we were in the cone of silence and in a safe space, a nurture nest, if you will, what's the policy intervention or policy innovation that you see as having the most amount of impact at this point? It's to anyone who wants to respond.
Yeah, I know that's a direct to the point of what you're raising, but I think it's this larger issue of, as I put out, the need to define universal service. I'm somewhat agnostic on, as I said, the 7 features that I identified, how those get defined. I think if you have a regulator that's defining, like in the FCC, you can adapt to the changing marketplace. It's not set in stone forever, and it doesn't take an act of Congress to change that. You can be nimble in that regard. My concern is in this postal world, it's rooted in the Constitution. It started in 1775. We have not had that public policy debate of what is it that we expect from this government institution. And as a regulator, if we were to define it like the FCC, we would do it in an open proceeding where we would get input from the American public and folks and come to what I think would be a rational conclusion. So I wouldn't want to prejudge that per se, and frankly, I think it really does require some thoughtful thinking through what are the implications. But in the absence of that definition, the world is changing so drastically right now. I worry that our nation's postal system will continue to be battered by, that they're not, there's things folks want them to do that they believe are part of the universal service mission they're not doing, and ask them to take it on or demand that they take it on, and yet may add more costs, and at the same time tell them not to do certain things because it's viewed that that's not part of their mission, when in fact maybe it should or could be and could actually help ensure that's self-sustaining. So I think the time has come to have that debate, but exactly what that is from my perspective, I'm somewhat agnostic on that. I think whatever we do, it should be self-sustaining. I don't believe it's realistic in this environment to expect that the United States Congress is going to start going back to taxpayer appropriations for the United States Postal Service. I think that's just a reality. So I think that may be a constraining feature of looking at it, but beyond that, I think the door is more wide open and needs to be looked at.
I'm most excited about diversification. It'll allow the evolution to begin again of the Postal Service, and innovation to be introduced. It'll also provide adequate revenue for the Postal Service. And the second one is the emergence of neighborhood services on the part of the carriers and those trucks. We have something really frightening headed toward us, the specter of megacities, and on the East Coast and in China, megacity clusters. We're not ready for that, and we'd better not give up our last best chance of helping people through that immense transition.
So, Andrew, to your question, I actually agree with David on this one in terms of diversification, but it raises another issue. Our new president and the government is placing a lot of emphasis on critical infrastructures, national infrastructures. I don't believe, and Lori, apologies, but I don't believe that they're including the postal service infrastructure as part of their deliberations on critical infrastructure investments in this country. And I think that's a huge mistake. The postal infrastructure is just as critical as the telecom infrastructure, as the airlines and shipping and ports and all these critical infrastructures. But having said that, I don't believe that governments are necessarily the best at running critical infrastructures from an operating point of view. I believe that from a policy point of view, we as a nation need to view this as such a critical part of our infrastructure that we need to invest in this just as much as we think about investing in fixing our roads and bridges and tunnels, you know, like Holland Tunnel or Lincoln Tunnel between Manhattan and New Jersey. Our connections for carrying commerce and communications is just as important. So from a policy point of view, I think that would be what I would recommend, that we as a community, and Chairman Taub, I keep turning back to Robert, and Lori, since you are in a very unique position to kind of recommend that.
Okay. John, I think, had a question?
Yeah, I just want to be sure someone else doesn't. But I just sort of wanted to point out, a lot of people don't realize, particularly people from overseas, that this United States Postal Service is highly privatized, maybe with a small p. And I'll look at David Handel over there, who just calculated and published the list of $14 billion in payments from the USPS to contractors. And those are private businesses. And then also this unique American design of work sharing is also a remarkable partnership that also is worth, I think the last time I saw, another $15 billion or something like that. So the USPS is really quite privatized. And frankly, I think that's a good thing. And I think the U.S. Postal Service should think more in that vein, meaning more as a partner and more as a platform, which they are, to support the private sector and let the private sector take the risks and make the big investments and go out of business and invent new businesses and become unicorns and that sort of thing, and really support the private sector in that regard. That's a sort of a structural thing. But the other thing I just wanted to make is, before we define the USO, I'll ask Chairman Taub again this, don't we need to maybe redefine mission? And we know that the Constitution said, okay, Congress has the authority to create post offices and post roads. Well, what does that mean? And then somewhere along the line, there's definition of mission and binding the nation together. And clearly, the Postal Service isn't binding the nation together in terms of communication anymore. I mean, there's all kinds of other ways that we do that electronically. What is the mission? And I think that has to be answered almost before we decide on what the obligation is to serve that mission. Yeah. And I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Well, I think in some ways it's a universal, from my perspective, universal service. Put aside what is it, it's an obligation, but universal service is their mission. Because otherwise, why is it a government institution? So those things in law that talk about binding the nation together, that in essence is cited as your universal service. Now, my call that the PRC could be a place that, like the FCC did, define it, would take an act of Congress. And I think in doing that, Congress would, in essence, have to grapple with that issue, because if they were going to tell the PRC to undertake, like the FCC did, a definition, inherent in that is, in essence, go through and define what the obligation, what the mission itself is. So that's at least how I reacted. If the mission is not a universal service obligation per se, then I do think it raises the larger question, then
Well, I guess-
why is it constituted as a government entity then? Is it simply because the scale and scope of operations are such that it should be a monopolist like AT&T? But at that point, we're in a different conversation about, why is the government providing this
Just
service?
one little follow on that. To me, still, there's the question of what is the service? And I have a view on that it's delivery. And to pick up on other things Dave has said and others, using work sharing and parcel select, the idea that the Postal Service is the service they need to provide is delivery to the household. That to me could be a definition that I like, which would suggest that they probably shouldn't be so competitive on the front end, because the front end is, it's pretty well serviced.
That's a good point, John. I would posit that in the 7 attributes I laid out that the Commission identified in 2008, inherent in that, you would get to that issue of, so for example, the Commission in 2008 suggested that, looking at the range of products, they felt that all postal products that the Postal Service offers constitute part of that universal service. Again, that was what the Commission was thinking in 2008, which would inherently mean the very competitive postal products of parcels and packages would be viewed as part of the universal service mission. Now, is that the case? When you look at that, that's a very competitive environment, but the thought would be that's part of what they're supposed to be providing. But it's an important point.
I really want to add that I think that the Postal Service does bind the nation. It erases the difference between living in a remote area and in the city. And in a wealthy neighborhood and a poor neighborhood, the Postal Service still brings the world to the poorest child in the worst neighborhood of America.
Good point.
Okay, I know we only have about 2 minutes left, but I know, Ramesh, you had wanted
No,
to
I
respond
just
to that
wanted to
question.
agree with Robert in the sense that definition of the USO is probably doable in the way I understand our government works, whereas redefinition of the core mission might need a constitutional amendment. And I don't think that's going to happen in a hurry.
I know we're already late, so I want to close up shop here, but I'm sure these folks would be happy to answer any questions you have. And again, I lost my last slide, but again, I think what we're trying to do here is continue this dialogue. So we're open to any further comments, questions, inputs that you all would like to have, and hopefully you'll see some written summary of all of this soon. Thank you again, and thank you. Please thank my panel.